Good afternoon to all my friends of the California Funeral Directors Association. I wish very much that I could be there with you today. Unfortunately, for the last 2 years, the annual convention has taken place in the week that we move bills from the policy committee to the fiscal committee in the second house, and I'm unable to leave Sacramento. But I do wish I was there. I wish I could spend some time with you. I had 24, 25 of you up in my office not too long ago. It was an extraordinarily enjoyable day, especially to meet so many young funeral directors who are making such a difference in our profession and who bring such dignity and grace to what we do for the people of California. I want to just go over a few of the bills, not to go over everything, but to get a sense of what's happening in California. Last year, there were questions raised about the NOR bill, the Natural Organic Reduction Bill, and how it impacts funeral directors and what it will mean for the people of California. I have opined and have written that the California Funeral Directors Association supports consumer options. One of the reasons that we did alkaline hydrolysis, one of the reasons that we've seen such an expansion in cremations. We did not sponsor the Natural Organic Reduction Bill. However, we did work closely with the committee staff and with the author, Assemblywoman Garcia, to make sure that technically it would make sense. Just consider a couple of deals. First of all, California is one of only 6 states that allows the natural organic reduction. The date for implementation is 2027. That means that probably beginning next year, the department will begin taking testimony and bringing in information and evidence to start putting together the regulatory action to initiate the process in California. These discussions will be comprehensive, and they will obviously include participation from the Funeral Directors Association, California Department of Public Health, the sponsors, the author's office, and those who have a grassroots interest in the issue itself. We would expect that the licensing process will result in funeral directors being the responsible entity for the natural organic reduction. First of all, it is very different from cremation. It requires much more space. It requires the ability to hold on to these bodies for 4 weeks to 8 weeks. It requires that the bodies be moved and as they reduce. And it means that facilities that offer this, for it to be financially feasible, will probably also offer cremation and hydrolysis, not alkaline hydrolysis. It's going to be feasible for all of us, important for all of us to participate in this particular discussion. However, after talking to the sponsor's office and talking to the author, I don't believe that we're going to see a Wild West kind of acceptance of reduction as the process for families deciding how to dispose of their loved ones' bodies. It's going to be another option. We will continue, of course, to see the increase in cremations, and we will see some alkaline hydrolysis. But alkaline hydrolysis and natural organic reduction will be outliers in terms of how we dispose of human bodies. When we talk about legislation and policy, one of the things that moves legislation are generally the stories that are big at the time. Legislators like to do legislation that gets notoriety and gets attention from their constituents and looks as if they are responding to particular problems. That brings up another bill that is interesting and something that we've talked about in the past, and that is pet burial in human cemeteries. It has been attempted a couple of times in California, in which legislators have come very close to offering it. They've sent it to us and have never quite been able to put together a piece of legislation that moves forward. For right or for wrong, I think anybody who walks or jogs, when you do and you're going down the street or to an area where you like to walk and jog, all of us have seen a new, very familiar sight of people pushing strollers. Inside the stroller isn't a baby, but inside the stroller are the animals, an animal, a dog or a cat. There is a label for it in California, of course, as there's a label for everything. It's called interspecies families. And in this particular instance, while Assemblywoman Jackie Irwin, who has written AB 528, is not calling it interspecies families, she does talk about the willingness and the importance for some families to make sure that their pet can be buried with them. CFDA has followed and listened to CMAQ on much of this. CMAQ has taken a distant approach. And part of it is because this legislation really is written in some ways better than what we've seen in the past, and in other ways is written too vague and result in a great deal of regulatory action. AB 528 creates a situation which the governing board can decide whether or not a pet can be buried in a human cemetery. There is no criterion on how the governing board reaches that conclusion, but it is written in the law, which ostensibly works for an indemnification purposes also, that the governing board can decide whether or not pets can be buried in a human cemetery. The second thing is that the area in which the pets are buried are separated from burials that are exclusively for human beings. Now, if I was there with you in person at this point, someone would raise their hand and catch on to the fact that I did forget a very important element. And when we talk about pet burials, the pet is not buried independently in the cemetery, but is buried in a separate box along with the owner of the plot, with their human owner. The problem with the legislation is that it's also very vague. It will establish the idea that a governing board can allow it. But what it doesn't do is that it doesn't establish what kind of pets can be buried in the pet cemetery. If you read the analysis says the furry animal pets who are so important to families can be buried. But we're not just talking, the legislation does not delineate that it can be a dog or a cat. And so one of the issues that we have raised, and we've raised it with the author, and we've had the discussion with the Bureau, is that can you bury, a pet horse? There was a while back in which someone had a comfort animal on an airplane, and everybody thinks that it's going to be a dog, got on the airplane with their comfort animal, and it was a peacock. And as ludicrous as this becomes, what is the space between a peacock and a racehorse that you can bury within the human cemetery? Are we going to have pet snakes? Are we going to have pet lizards? All of these things need to be decided. The other thing is the burial itself. I think that the Bureau is going to push that it has to be cremated remains of the pet, although that is not distinct in the bill. And of course, you raise the other issue. You take someone like Merrill Mefford, who I think is with you today. Merrill is almost 112 years old. And in all of those years, he's had probably 25 or 30 pets. Can Merrill bury all of them with him in his grave? Can you just bury 2? Is there going to be a limit? When you bury these pets, now we're talking about endowment questions. We're talking about maintenance questions. Is families going to be responsible? And of course, as one individual raised, are we going to outlaw the idea that when the human dies, that we're not going to allow the pet to be euthanized and placed in the grave with them? So there are those issues. AB 1560 is another bill that's important to us. I believe Steve Schott is with you today. Steve has been really such a great resource on so many issues, but this is one that Steve has taken a real personal interest in and has been a leader in moving the Flora bill forward. And what this does, it makes technical revisions in terms of the ownership of a crematory, different from a funeral home in which the work can continue while the transition is being made. With the crematories, that has not been possible. And it's been a complicating factor And the discussion with the Bureau to ease the operations between one owner and another have allowed for this bill to be forward. It is clear that the Bureau is willing to be collaborative as long as the consumer is protected and as long as they are notified in a timely manner in the inspections that are necessary before the ownership changes hands is done. The Bureau has been good to work with this year. They've been good to work with every year, I believe, but they've been good this year. I think that they've become more experienced and more understanding of what the issues are that are important to us. And I believe that they make an effort. There are a lot of boards and bureaus and commissions that are totally at odds with those that they regulate. We are not in that situation. There are instances in which we disagree with them and disagree with them rather openly, as you remember in the past, especially in terms of how personnel will be used in the future. We will have a sunset review hearing next year. And in that sunset review, I think one of the important issues we're going to bring up is that structurally what's been happening with the Bureau has not changed demonstrably at the same time that we have seen such a shift from the traditional funerals to cremation and now the allowance of other ways to reduce the body. There are other bills that we are watching closely. Certainly those bills that allow leave, we're going to see some legislation in which we will revisit again the employee's right to bereavement leave, certainly to sick leave. We did see during the pandemic that an individual could take off work if they were in fear that they may catch the disease. And it kind of changes legislatively and policy and socially how we look at how we do sick leave and how we do bereavement leave and those kinds of things. We're also dealing with SB 253. I think many of you remember that this is very similar to last year's Senate Bill 260. And what this bill does is it mandates that the greenhouse gas emissions evident in corporations doing business in California must become public information. It's being called the Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act. And of course, we're warily reviewing it. We are not in favor of it. We think it's not completely cooked, just as it wasn't last year in 260. And we're concerned that the information is going to be used to inhibit rather than to promote the way that we do business. And I think it could have a significant impact on our crematoriums, just as we start seeing a greater emphasis on businesses being forced to use electric rather than gas in their businesses. I don't want to go on too long. I'm not as lively on video as I am in person. I do want to say that the budget will be passed likely next week. They pass a budget and then they do a series of trailer bills afterwards in which they figure out what they're going to do and how to delineate how they spend that budget money. I think what's interesting is that when I started working for you about 25 years ago, the budget in California was around 60 to 70 million. The budget in California is now over 300 million. And part of that is because we're a capital gains state. And when the stock market is going well and when real estate is going well, those are the two major parts of the stool. And we find out is that there's more money than we can possibly spend. Doesn't mean that the government doesn't try spending it, but it is more money than we can spend and the budget gets blown out of proportion. For the first time in this governor's administration, he is facing a deficit. And so instead of having all kinds of money in which to give it away, we're now in a situation where we're going to see parks being closed and libraries closed and limitations being placed on libraries and schools and recreational facilities. It's going to be a different kind of deal. It also folds into the idea that California remains a very difficult place to do business. As most of you realize from reading the newspapers, in 1849, they discovered gold in California, and from then on, it was an unimpeded population explosion. Everyone wanted to live in California. However, in the last 3 years, what we've seen is that the California dream has been blown apart a bit, with problems with homelessness, with high taxes, with the difficulties of doing business, with high cost of housing. And there was a recent poll from the Los Angeles Times that said 4 out of 10 people who live in California are considering moving to another state. We have seen for the first time in our history that California has lost a congressional member. All these years in which we picked up a new congressional member because our population has risen, for the first time we have lost a congressional member, gave it back because our population is reducing. All issues that have an importance in terms of tax structure and tax base. I don't want to go on too long, except to say that I have always enjoyed visiting with you down there. I missed the opportunity to have a few cold beers and to say hi to some old friends and to say hi to some new friends. Matthew knows how to reach me, so if any of you ever have questions, and I say this, and I always like it because I do get phone calls from individual members who will have concerns or issues periodically. So please call me. I look forward to it. I thank you for the opportunity to join you, at least virtually. And I hope the rest of the convention is joyful and that everybody stays safe. So thank you very much for your time, and I will talk to you soon.